Let's begin this segment by talking about what comprises an argument. Quite often in popular discourse, we think of an argument as something bad. We had an argument with our parents. We had an argument with our spouse. We had an argument with our boss or perhaps a coworker, and that was somehow unfortunate. Our spin on the concept of argument is quite a bit different and not at all negative. We believe that what an argument really is the use of logic and reasoning to try to make a point or to prove something to someone. And we think that that's basically a productive process. An argument, I believe, claims one thing of another. It relates two items that exist in the world or two ideas and explains the relationship that they have to each other. An argument gives reasons. A lot of people are able to make claims. They say, for example, that the New York Yankees are the best baseball team, or British automobiles are the best, or Hong Kong businesses are the most productive. But it becomes an argument when people give reasons as to why something is true. One of my teachers used to say that it's not good enough just to guess at the right answer. You have to be able to show your work as to why you arrived at that answer. And to me, that's really the essence of an argument. I want to just give you a couple of definitions of argument and argumentation so that we have some common ground to work with. Robert Huber, was a professor at the University of Vermont, wrote an argumentation textbook called Influencing Through Argument, which is available online at the website, and I would encourage you to check it out as a good way to explore these issues. He says, argument is that process in communication where logic is used to influence others. It's a part of communication, and it uses logic and it uses reasoning. It's linked to the persuasion process. It is the logical component of the persuasion process. George Ziegler of Wayne State University, one of America's leading debate scholars over the last 30 years, has defined argumentation as an area of study a little differently, and I think it's very illuminating. He says that argumentation is the study of the logical principles which underlie the examination and presentation of persuasive claims. You notice this is a little different than just a definition of an argument. It's the study of logical principles that make up specific ideas. And it is, again, linked to persuasion. I think George Ziegler's approach suggests a twin emphasis in argumentation. The process through which, using your own logic and reasoning, you decide for yourself what is probably true. Ultimately, we should all make our own decisions and our own conclusions based on sound reasoning and good logic, unless we want to conduct our lives randomly, which is not likely to be productive. A logical and reasoned approach to our life is probably a lot more productive in producing the kind of situations that we'll be happy in and in which the world and life for all in it will be more beneficial and more productive. But the second part of that, the first part being finding out for yourself what's probably true, the second part is to use these arguments, these items of reasoning and logic, to try to share with others what you have found and perhaps get them to accept your ideas as being useful and productive. So, every time we talk about argumentation, we're talking about how we as individuals can decide what we believe, and also the kinds of ideas and arguments we will use to try to tell others about what we've decided and what we believe, hoping that some of them will decide to embrace our ideas, or failing that, will critique our ideas so that we can improve them based on their logic and reasoning. I want to turn now to a diagram of the argumentative process developed by British argumentative theorist and brilliant essayist Stephen Toulmin. He really launched a revolution against the neo-Aristotelian approach to logic, and had perhaps a more socially productive way of analyzing arguments and logic. He tried to create a perspective and a framework within which people could look at different kinds of arguments and try to understand. In so doing, he outlined a number of components that go into every argument, and I believe that this diagram will help you understand some of these. There are three primary components that are featured here. The first is the idea of data. Data. Every argument starts with data. Arguments are based on information, facts, ideas that are already accepted by the audience, pieces of information or concepts which have been independently proven. The starting point of every argument is something that we already accept and we already believe as data. From there, we can use that data and manipulate it using logical processes to come to some kind of conclusion. At the right side of the diagram, we see the result of the argument, which is the claim. The claim. And the claim is what you're trying to prove. And we established earlier what some of these claims might be. That Hong Kong businesses are the most efficient, that British cars are the highest quality vehicles, or any number of other claims that you might imagine. Now, the claim is generally what all that most people trying to make a point offer, their conclusion. The claim is really the end point of the logical process. It establishes something. It's what you're trying to prove. Now, there are a number of different kinds of claims that you can make. Does something exist? What is that something? What is it? To define it, to describe it. Claims also establish the worth or lack of worth that certain things have. That they are good, that they are bad, that they are valuable, that they are not valuable. Claims can also establish for us what we should do. We can have claims about advocacy, that we should dismantle nuclear weapons, that we should continue using fossil fuels because we needn't worry about global warming. These are the kinds of claims that are established. The magic element in Toulmin's model is the warrant, which allows us to make the jump from data to claim. A warrant is basically a logical concept that we use to prove something to be true. Warrants come in several different kinds. Some of the most obvious that you're probably familiar with would be an authoritative warrant. Some authority, some expert says it's true, and so we ought to believe, for example, that nuclear power plants are inherently safe. Or other warrants might be motivational, based on our common understandings of human nature, that people want to improve their situation, that people are curious. Arguments can also be proven based on these motivational ideas. But the most important kind of warrants are the substantive warrants, the kinds of warrants that come down to us from antiquity and have been useful from the times of Aristotle to the times that we experience today. These are logical concepts of arguments. Arguments based on cause. Arguments based on sign. Arguments based on generalizations. Establishing arguments based on parallel cases, on membership in a category or class. These are the kinds of logical ideas that should be used as often as possible as warrants for your arguments. So Toulmin establishes that we have data and we use various warrants in analyzing that data in order to establish a claim, the argument that we're trying to prove. Toulmin also adds another triad of elements which are useful in critiquing arguments, finding their weaknesses, and establishing for us whether we should accept them and how much acceptance we should give them. For example, backing. You can look and see if a given warrant has a lot of support. What kind of reliability does it have? What kind of evidence supports it? Any warrant leading to any kind of claim should be analyzed in terms of rebuttal. Rebuttal. That's where you look for the weaknesses in this data warrant claim sequence. You look for exceptions. You look for criticisms. You look for alternatives. Finally, what you attach to the claim is the final element of Toulmin 6, the qualifier. Every argument and every claim that you establish needs to be qualified. Do you accept it absolutely, positively? Do you reject it? Do you accept that it is always true, often true, sometimes true, that something will happen or won't happen or might happen? These 6 elements operate together. The data manipulated by the warrant to provide a claim. If we look for the backing and find it to be weak, if there are many powerful rebuttals, then it should have a very strong qualifier. Maybe it is not true, maybe we should not accept it, or perhaps we should reject it. Stephen Toulmin, in this work, provides us with an interesting way to diagram and understand arguments. I would encourage you to investigate his approach to argumentation a bit closer, and you can do that at our website.
I've been asked to speak to you about induction. There are a lot of strategies associated with reasoning, and you've probably heard of the first 2. They are deduction and induction. Deduction is the process by which we take a rule that we know is true and apply the rule in examining the world around us. Induction is where we draw a generalization based upon observations we make. We take a series of illustrations or examples, look for commonalities, and make a thesis from those commonalities. I'll be talking about the second one here. In the strategies of persuasion, there's a few things I wanted to mention. First, what we attempt to try to do in persuasion is to make things happen. And in order to make things happen, we need to be able to have a thesis that we can build upon to convince people that they should change their opinions and attitudes. We mostly in persuasion want to change the way people think. We're not probably going to be able to change the way they act, which is incredibly difficult to do, and we probably aren't going to change their belief systems. But we can change their very specific feelings towards things and phenomenon, things we call attitudes, and we can definitely change their opinions, which tend to be very loosely held. In persuasion, therefore, we spend an incredible amount of time talking about agenda building, because that's something that we can successfully accomplish in persuasion. We can convince people to change their agendas. We can convince people that they should reorder the values that they uphold. They should reorder the stances they take on objects and phenomena around them. They should reorder their attitudes. Our attitudes tend to be built on a horizontal structure, a hierarchy. In other words, at the top of the hierarchy will be the attitudes we most devoutly believe are true, and at the bottom will be the ones that change almost whimsically. What we can do in argument is we can shift items that are on the top of the agenda with those that are further down, and those that are further down can actually rise on the agenda. And the way we often do this is by engaging in things like induction. Let me give you a sense of how induction functions. Induction is a type of example argumentation. It's associated with the scientific method. It's associated with scientific objectivism. It suggests that one of the best ways to actually get things accomplished is to look at examples and experimental design. Now, in the laboratory, that's often relatively easy to do. And the reason is because we have control situations. That's not true in the real world. In the real world, when we make a series of observations, we're not really comparing those observations to non-observations or to controlled instances. We are just looking at them as they occur within the system we're examining. So it's not really strict scientific objectivity, at least it's not in the social science world. But it is the basis for much studying. Why do people engage in induction? Well, the first reason they engage in deduction is because it's a way of building proof. That if you make a series of observations and you make a series of illustrations, you can use those as a basis of generating, which is what the second purpose of induction is, which is to construct a hypothesis. You would construct a hypothesis based upon the illustrations and observations you make. Those hypotheses that you construct then, in turn, are used as rules for subsequent reasoning. There is a series of articles and a few books that have been written on this induction that argues that induction is the entire basis for deduction. Since deduction is rule-based, rules need to be constructed somehow, and those rules are generally constructed inductively. So induction is often looked as the father of all reasoning. Where can we find examples of this process? Well, the first area you can look for examples is in the political process itself. Political candidates use induction very often in making their claims, especially political claims associated with platforms which they might want to use in the political arena and in campaigns. They might make a series of observations about how food assistance programs have worked in some model cities, and based upon how the food assistance programs worked in those model cities, they might want to generalize and say, if we adopt a program like the program that was adopted in Austin, which was incredibly successful, then we adopt that nationwide, it might be successful there as well. And so we find that it's often used in the political process. It's often used in interpersonal communications as well. We often establish trust with individuals that we engage with based upon induction. We would, for example, tell a friend that when you've asked me to do a favor for you in the past, I have always done that favor. Hence, based upon that illustration or that example, you can draw the conclusion that I am trustworthy. We find it also, of course, in science. Popular in any of the objective sciences, chemistry, physics, biology, any of the natural sciences. Scientists will engage in induction. They engage in experimental design, they take a set of readings, they then repeat the experiment, and if these readings tend to be correlated, they might draw a broad hypothesis as a consequence. How do we refute induction? There generally tends to be two major tests in induction. The first deals with sample size. When we draw an induction, we will make an observation based on a set of illustrations. That set needs to be sufficiently large. In other words, you're not allowed to draw a conclusion that is broad if it's based on a sample that is not. This phenomenon occurs quite often in many different settings. Let's return for a little moment to the political process. In the United States, the political process is driven by polling. In a campaign, one candidate will make a political statement about some program. Let's assume that the political candidate makes a statement about tax cuts. The next day, his pollsters will then engage in a series of pollings, and in the polling process would ask the people they have selected for their poll whether they think the tax cut program that had just been advocated is desirable or undesirable. Based upon the finding, they might inform the political candidate that this specific program he's advocating is actually going well and is reading well, and so it should be continued, or it's not going well and not reading well among the public and he should step away from it. The polls are designed in such a way that you can sample a group of individuals and draw a reliable conclusion. Those types of polls generally take place with hundreds of respondents, and based upon the hundreds of respondents, they decide that, if 150, 200, 300, or 400 respondents think it's a good idea in our sample, that might be enough for us to predict that it's generally going very well on the national scale. So the first test associated with induction tends to be simply a test of sample size. In formal statistics, there are certain tests that are used to decide how big a sample needs to be. In the social science, those tests don't often work very well. And so when we decide what is the appropriate sample size, we have to use a sort of rule of thumb on it. The second test is called the test of representativeness. In other words, the sample itself must represent the broader set from which it's drawn. Let's go back to our study of polling. If, for example, I decide to poll to determine whether a policy being advocated by a specific candidate will read well with the public, I need to make sure that the small sample I select, even if it's hundreds of respondents, adequately represents the public. And if I'm polling for a Republican candidate and I select an all-Republican sample for my poll, that might not represent the public at large. And so the public is not going to, we're not going to get the type of useful information that we can use to project on how the public will respond to the policies being advocated. The tests, therefore, associated with induction are tests of sample size and representativeness. Finally, where is the induction used more often? It's used in illustration and observation type arguments that are constructed based upon small samples, small studies, model programs, and deciding that those small studies or model programs would allow us to predict some grander conclusion about what would be effective in the nation at large. Secondly, it's often used in narration. We decide whether stories really do reflect reality based upon whether the story represents what happens on a day-to-day basis in terms of the general population about which we're describing in the stories we tell. So in terms of induction, we know it's associated with scientific objectivism, and it's most importantly correlated to arguments of example from which we draw broad generalizations. We know also that it's found pretty predominantly throughout our cultures, especially in the West. And we know that there are two basic tests we use when we refute induction. The first is the test of its sample size, and the second is the test of representativeness. Finally, we find that induction is used in a lot of different settings, especially in terms of illustration and in terms of designing observations and compiling them in order to make broader conclusions, and it's also actually used in the process of narration as well.
David's talked to you about inductive forms of argument, and I want to talk for a few minutes about deductive styles of argument. And in doing that, I'll be drawing on the classical work of Aristotle and the more contemporary work of my predecessor at the University of Vermont, Robert Huber. What is a deductive argument? What is deduction? Well, deduction is basically when you draw conclusions from premises. Quite often you have a general premise and a particular premise, and you take these two concepts that you know and understand, you rub them against one another in the reasoning process, and you come up with a new conclusion. The classical deductive argument is called the syllogism. It has three parts, three premises: the major premise, the minor premise, and the conclusion. And an example of the classic syllogism is where the first premise would be that all humans die. The second premise would be that Socrates is a human. And from those two premises, we would draw the conclusion that Socrates will die. Now, this is the classic form of reasoning used by many mystery novel detectives and many of those who actually in real life are solving crimes. They take deductive premises and they use them to analyze specific data to try to come up with conclusions. And Sherlock Holmes being perhaps the most famous of the mystery drama and literature figures to have used deductive reasoning. And once you have the right premises together, it's elementary, my dear Watson, as to what the conclusion is. These premises can be universal, they can be particular, they can be affirmative or negative. But generally in a deductive argument, there are three premises. Now, when you hear deductive arguments in real life, you don't necessarily hear them in all their detail with three separate premises. A lot of times, they will be what's better known as the enthymeme. They will be an enthymeme. That's where one part of the argument is left out. For example, I could tell you that Socrates is a human, and therefore tell you that Socrates will die. You already know that all humans die. You already have that information, and I don't need to tell it to you. So many times there are deductive arguments, and they don't appear to us rhetorically in all their detail, but nevertheless the detail is there. Primarily because the major premise, or the beginning of the deductive argument, is something that the audience, the listener, already knows. So the enthymeme really, and how you design it and what you leave out, is, as many have said, the body and soul of argumentative persuasion. What I want to do is to talk about three different types of deduction. I think it's possible for you to study this in many other ways. Classical texts have a lot of information about syllogism. A lot of logic and argument texts will talk to you about how to construct and test syllogisms. I think it's more useful in applying deductive argument to real life to think about the three basic kinds of deductive arguments. The first is what I call the categorical deduction. The categorical deduction. That's where you take a general law or truth and you apply it to a specific situation or a specific category. For example, we could say that conservatives believe that the government should not interfere in the economic marketplace. Premise number one. Premise number two, Meany is a self-identified and practicing conservative. Premise number two. And then our conclusion, therefore, Meany believes that government should not be involved and interfere in the economic marketplace. So you take a general statement about a group or a category or a situation, then you apply that general statement to a member or an occupier of that group, category, or situation, and then you can assume what is true of the whole. In this instance, it might be true of the parts. Now, of course, there are always problems in any argument. You could have false information, you can have false associations, but basically in testing a categorical deduction, if I would say that all Hungarians are jolly, for example, and Bill is a Hungarian, therefore Bill is jolly. That's not always true. He's not always jolly. Not everyone who's a Hungarian is jolly. So you have to be aware of the tests that you apply to these kind of arguments. For example, you would want to know, is this true of all? Are all Hungarians jolly? Are all conservatives those who think that the government should not become involved in the marketplace? Or just many? Or most? And it's very important when you put together an argument like this to use a qualifier. I think it's also very important to be careful when you're using categorical deductions and you're talking about people. You can see a lot of racist, ethnic stereotypes that are used, nationalist, xenophobic stereotypes can be used and abused through the casual and illogical use to use deductive arguments and these sort of categorical deductions. Too often the kinds of assumptions we have about other groups, ones that we're not involved in, can be negative. It's very important to realize that a categorical deduction is very rarely always true, although it can be. Proper use of it necessitates the use of a qualifier. So that's the first kind I want to talk about, a categorical deduction. Let's talk about type number two, a disjunctive deduction. A disjunctive deduction. This is where two or more alternatives are posited. We reject some of them, and therefore the one that remains that hasn't been rejected is what we would do. Let me just give you an example of a simple disjunctive deduction. We could go to the movies, we could go to the dance, or we could stay home tonight. These are our options. Well, we don't want to go to the movies and we don't want to go home stay home because those things are passive. They're not active, and we sort of feel active. So we reject those things that are passive. Therefore, having rejected the passive alternatives, we take the active one. We decide to go to the dance, and we dance away the night happily. So we can see in this argument, we can go to the movies, we can go to the dance, or we can stay home. But we don't want to go to the movies and we don't want to stay home because that's too passive. Therefore, the conclusion is we should go to the dance. Now, there are some basic tests with this, and I think that we see this kind of argument all the time. People map out their options and they evaluate them and reject some and adopt others, and that's clearly a case of disjunctive deduction. We do it every time we come to a crossroads and aren't sure which way we should turn. But the basic tests for disjunctive deduction are pretty simple. Is it really an either-or situation? Could we, in fact, go to the movies and then go to the dance? Are they really alternatives? Are there more alternatives than these? Are there other things that we might have done besides these three? And finally, what criticisms can we offer to the one that's left? Perhaps there's a terrible band that's playing at the dance. Perhaps the music is bad, or people that we don't like are there. So you have to do all those things in a disjunctive deduction. Either or, are there more options, and criticize the remaining option. Finally, I want to talk about the third kind, hypothetical deduction. That which stipulates a hypothetical or conditional relationship. This can also be thought of as causal argument, and John's going to be talking more about that later. If X takes place, we say, then Y. For example, if you smoke cigarettes, it increases the risk of lung cancer. Bill smokes cigarettes. Therefore, Bill has an increased risk of lung cancer. There's an antecedent, smoking cigarettes, and then a consequent, which is that you get lung cancer. So many arguments that we see in everyday life are these sort of hypothetical deductions. If this, then something else. That's the key, that this is it. Now, how do you test this kind of thing? Well, you look for other factors, other causes, other things that might cause cancer other than smoking. You look to the various tests of causation that John's going to be talking to you about. And you establish some kind of probability. Sure, you're more likely to get lung cancer if you smoke cigarettes, but how much more likely? What is the probability? I'm more likely to get run over if I walk around in the city, but I can't say that, well, then I must never do anything and only always sit in one spot, because the probability is still very small. So in testing hypothetical deductions, you look for other factors, other causes, and you try to establish some kind of probability dimension. What's the probability that's connected with this relationship? So deductive reasoning, the big tool of Sherlock Holmes, is extremely useful for you as a critical citizen, and here are three basic types: categorical, disjunctive, and hypothetical.
Hello, I'm here to discuss the issue of causation. There are many issues in a debate that address the issue of causation. Quite simply, causation is the relationship of cause and effect, one condition leading to another or producing a particular effect or outcome. For example, if one has population increases, will that lead to more development and subsequent environmental pollution? And so causation is the issue of one condition leading to another or producing an effect. This is an issue for both the proposition or affirmative side in a debate and the opposition or negative side in a debate. Let me just say that the majority of debates are framed in a problem-solution framework. In other words, debaters construct in a logical way a case that argues in favor of a motion by identifying a social, economic, political, human rights problem, and then proposing a solution to address that particular problem. It's necessary to identify the cause of a problem simply to determine whether or not it is a problem at all. If we take an example, and I'll use this example throughout the discussion on the issue of causation, the issue of proliferation of weapons of mass destruction. What is the cause of the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction? Is it, as according to a number of individuals, that we simply produce more crazy leaders of nations these days than we did in the past? More egocentric individuals who simply, as an issue of national or personal pride, want the biggest and baddest weapons for their country? Is it because many countries model the great powers, the United States, Russia, China, France, Great Britain, all possess nuclear weapons and have the capability of producing chemical and biological weapons of great terror? Is it that other nations want to model those great powers? This is the argument made about weapons proliferation for nuclear weapons production in India and Pakistan. Is it that people want a negotiating tool to use in military discussions with neighbors? Is it a device for internal dissent? Well, it's necessary to identify what the cause of the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction is in order to fashion an appropriate remedy for that particular problem. You need to be able to identify remedies that are technically sufficient and also feasible for the identified problem. Is it sufficient if we identify the cause of the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction? If the cause is self-defense, nations are insecure, they want to produce weapons of mass destruction to guarantee their sovereignty and the protection of their national borders and their home population. Is it sufficient to then propose as a solution to the problem of proliferation of weapons of mass destruction that the United Nations issue a statement opposing the use of weapons of mass destruction? Probably not. Yes, there's a technical capability. The United Nations is surely capable of issuing a resolution voted on by the General Assembly and approved by each member nation to issue as a non-binding resolution in its own country that simply states that we oppose the use of weapons of mass destruction. But would that, in a feasible way, reduce the likelihood that nations interested in protecting themselves, if that's the justification for the production of weapons of mass destruction, would the passage of a resolution, even if countries agreed to pass similar non-binding resolutions within their own states, would it necessarily reduce the desire or the production of weapons of mass destruction? It seems quite unlikely. Governments and the United Nations pass resolutions all the time that are non-binding in nature, and the result is that no one feels that they should follow them if their national interests are opposed to them. And so if the issue is the national interest is in favor of the production of weapons of mass destruction, then the solution that's proposed must meet that issue. There are ways in which one can evaluate causes and effects in a debate, and let me mention three of those. First, one should examine whether or not other causes might be responsible for the observed effect. Most things have multiple causes, not a single cause. As we just noticed with the issue of weapons of mass destruction, their proliferation might be caused by the particular values held by national leaders, a sense of national pride, a need for self-defense, modeling based on the great powers, a negotiating tool with neighbors, or the ability to cope with internal dissent. There are a half dozen different causes that might be responsible for the observed effect, the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction. And so if a government or affirmative team focuses on a single cause, perhaps they would not be able to eliminate the problem, as we just simply described a moment ago, about other causes, in this circumstance, self-defense, trumping or triumphing over the solution, if the solution is simply a resolution, a statement of good intention about eliminating weapons of mass destruction. Secondly, is the cause sufficient to produce the effect? Is the cause sufficient to produce the effect? Certainly some nations, based on principles of national pride, might be interested in producing weapons of mass destruction. But that may not be a sufficient cause to make the decision to proliferate and actually produce weapons of mass destruction and put them in the field as operational weapons. National pride might be an ancillary cause for the production of weapons of mass destruction, but may be insufficient in and of itself. There is a literature that argues that national pride was a reason for India and Pakistan to produce nuclear weapons, but it seems unlikely that without a hostile neighbor with whom each country had waged war 3 times in the past 50 years, that national pride alone would be sufficient to produce weapons of mass destruction. The issue of self-defense might also be an issue for those nations. Thirdly, can the debaters confuse the issues of cause and effect, actually calling one thing a cause when it is, in fact, an effect, a consequence? In this circumstance, one might argue that the production of weapons of mass destruction might lead to their use. We have a cause, production of weapons of mass destruction, and a consequence. More weapons that are produced means that the probability of use of those weapons increases. But it may be the case that it is the use of weapons of mass destruction that actually has led to their production. That the use of weapons of mass destruction, the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, or the use of chemical weapons in the First World War, or their use in internal struggle, for example, the Iraqi use of chemical weapons against a dissenting Kurdish population, might actually trigger the production of those same weapons in other countries. And so it may be the case that a debater has confused or reversed the idea of cause and effect. The same might be said for participation in debate. Many people make an argument that debate promotes critical thinking. Well, is that the case, or is it that self-selection of individuals who participate in debate and individuals who are interested in debate might be high-level critical thinkers, that it's actually not the case that debate that promotes critical thinking, but that critical thinking actually is responsible for the generation of the idea of debate and encouragement for debate and the institutionalization of debate. And so sometimes it's an issue that we confuse matters of cause and effect, and that the effect is actually what generates a condition that leads to a cause. These are the issues of cause and effect. They are useful for both sides in a debate and are the foundations for intriguing arguments for the foundation of problems and solutions, as well as the exploration of opposing arguments to those positions.